What makes reading from MDN docs really good is their table of content component. You can see we have a bunch of links that you can navigate between sections by clicking on them. And when you click, it smooth scroll to that section. And after navigating to it, you can see that the URL is updated so you can bookmark it or share it. And when you try to scroll in the page, you can see how the currently highlighted link is updated based on the current section you are viewing. So in this video, I'm gonna show you how to create this with vanilla JavaScript. We will build it in a reusable way so you can use it in all of your projects with a single function call. So let's jump in. So in this video, we're gonna build this demo. You can see we have the table of content here, the links, and we have the sections in the page. When you scroll, you can see how it updates, and I can navigate between the sections by clicking on it. And not only that, but it also updates the URL so you can save it and share it. So let's jump to the code to see how to implement this. So I removed the JavaScript code from that demo, so we end up with the HTML and CSS for that project. First, in the HTML, we can see that the table of content has this element. It consists of a UL element with a bunch of list items, and each item contains a link. And below that, we are displaying all the sections. You can see we are displaying the home, products, about, and contact, each one with a different class name added after the section. So section home, section products, and about, and contact. Now let's quickly see what we have in the CSS code. First, we are updating the page with the font family, color, and the background color. And for all the elements, we are setting box sizing to border box, and we are setting the margin and padding to 0 for the body, and we are setting the minimum height to 100 viewport. For the table of content, we are setting the position to fixed, and we are displaying it at the top right corner of the page with 50 pixels margin, and the width is 200 pixels and a little bit of box shadow. Now we are just resetting some styling for the UL element, and for the anchor element, the link within each list item, we are making the width 100 pixels, we are setting the default color, which is this color, and we are setting its display to block, some padding, and some color and text decoration to none. Now the important thing here is that you can see once we add a class name of highlighted to the anchor element, you can see we are changing the background color, which if you remember, it was a reddish color. Now below that, we are setting the border radius for the first element and the last element, so you can see this rounded corner. And below that, we are styling each section with a 90% viewport for the height, and some just display flex to center the content and some font size. And we are setting a different background color for each section so we can distinguish between them. And below that, we have some styling for the mobile. Now, before we write any JavaScript code, the first thing I'd like to do is to enable the anchor linking, or sometimes it's called fragment linking, which means if I click on the about, for example, it changes the URL, but it should also jump to that. In this case, it should not jump with a smooth scroll because we are not using JavaScript, but we are relying on the browser's behavior to jump to that section. And to do that, let's go to the HTML code. So you can see for each link, we are adding a hash symbol followed by the name. So for example, for the home, it's called home and products and so on. Now, when we click, it changes the current URL with that hash symbol and that link. Now, to make it jump to the corresponding section, we need to set the ID for each section to the same name here. For example, if we set the ID of products to products and we save, and if I click here, it will jump to that immediately. So now let's update that for all of the sections. Okay, so now we have fragment linking working, so I can navigate between the sections like this. Until this point, we have no JavaScript code, it's just relying on the browser. Now let's start writing our JavaScript code. So I'm gonna add a new JavaScript file here called scrollspy. Now the reason I'm calling it scrollspy is because this kind of UI is called scrollspy, which means that this navigator is spying on the page to see which section we are currently at so we can highlight the corresponding link. Okay, so now what we're gonna do here, we're going to export a new function called setup scroll spy. And this will take an element, and for now, nothing. Now the idea here is that we need to accept some element here, and this element should be the table of content. So we will pass it the whole div here, and then based on what we have configured on the page, it will add the ability to smooth scroll to the clicked link. So actually, let's just console log the element here. So I'm gonna say element. Now to use that, let's go to main.js and let's import it. And now let's call it. And now we're going to call it on this element. And we can fetch it by saying document.querySelector. And in this case, it's TOC, table of content. And that's what we are using here. So now if I open up the div console, you can see we are logging it here. Now let's go to scrollspy and continue working here. So now we will start here by fetching all the links within that table of content. So to do that, let's say const links. and we're going to say element because this is the element we are passing here, and we only want to fetch all the links within that element. So let's say query selector all. So we will fetch all the anchor elements that their href attribute start with the hash symbol. So you can see when we write the caret symbol followed by the equal sign, it will fetch any element that their attribute that we specify here starts with anything we put here. In this case, it's the hash symbol. So let's log here and see what we get. So you can see we are fetching all the links here, and they are the links we have in the table of content. Now, next thing we want to do here is we want to write a function that can highlight any link we give it. So let me show you this. If I say highlight link, and I pass it, for example, the second link we can get from the array here, it should highlight the product's link. So let's define that function here. So we're going to say function highlight link, and it will take a target link, and let's do that here. Now, the way we're going to do it, we're going to loop through all of these links, and we're going to compare if the past link is the same as the link we are looping, then we should set a class of highlighted. Otherwise, we should remove that class. So to do that, let's say links.forEach link, and if link is the same as the target link passed, then let's say link.classList add, and we're going to add highlighted. Otherwise, we should remove that. So now if we reload, we can see now product is highlighted. If we change it to something else, like the one after it, it should highlight that. But of course, we're not going to call this manually. I'm going to show you how to call that later. Now, one quick thing to note here is how I define the highlight link within that function. Now, the reason for that, I want this function to be able to access anything defined in that function. So you will notice that all of the functions I'm going to write will be inside that big function. And a great benefit of this is that we will end up with a single function that we can use in any of our projects, and everything will work out of the box. Now, if I try to click on one of these links, it just jumps directly to that section. But what we want to do is we want to smoothly scroll to that section. Now, to add that smooth animation, we can use a function that the browser gives us called scroll to. So in this function, we can pass it the top position that we want to scroll to, and another argument we can pass whether we want it to smoothly scroll to that or not. So let's pass top, and let's gonna say 200 pixels, and behavior, it's gonna be smooth. Now if I enter this, it will just scroll to that position with some smooth animation. Now, the way we're going to use this in our code, we're going to detect what link we have clicked, and based on that link, we need to grab the corresponding section and then get its top position and pass it to that function. Now, the next thing we need to do is to prevent the default behavior of this link click. So instead of making it jump to that section immediately, we want to take over that behavior and implement it ourselves. To do this, we're going to loop through all the links here, and for each link, we're going to add a new event listener, and it's going to be for the click. And let's accept the event. And what we're going to do, we're going to say prevent default. Now, if we save and try to click, it will not do anything. Now, instead, we want to get the current section ID and then scroll to it using the scroll to method I just showed you. But how can we get that section ID? If you remember from the HTML code, we have each section ID added to the link. So we can access the href attribute and just access it from here. So let's do this. We're going to say section ID link get attribute href. Now let's log this. Now if I click one of these things, you can see the section ID is about, contact, and home. So it works. But now we have the section ID. How can we get the corresponding section element? Now the actual element, like the about element or the contact element here. Well, we actually have to fetch all the sections in this page and then filter them using that ID. But the best way to do this, we need to give it a special data attribute so we can mark it as the section that we can use in our scroll spy function. Let's do that in the HTML code. Now you can see we have the ID for the section ID, but we also want our version for the section ID that we will use in the JavaScript code. And let's, for example, call it section ID. So we want it to be a data attribute. That's why we are prefixing it with data. And let's call it the same. It's going to be home. Now let's do the same for the other ones. Now let's go to the JavaScript code and fetch all the sections. So I'm going to say sections, and I'm going to fetch all the sections from the whole page. So let's say document, query selector all, and we're going to fetch anything that has the data attribute data section ID. Now let's log this. So you can see we are fetching all the sections. We can see we have home, product, about, and contact. So it works. Now let's see how we can get that section element using the section ID we have here. So let's remove this first. And to get it, let's say section. We're going to say sections.find. We're going to find it by section.dataset. dot section ID. So that way we can get the value of the data section ID. Let's compare it with the section ID. So if it equals section ID, then let's return it. But note that this would not work because section ID that we added to the data attribute doesn't have the hash symbol, whereas we have the hash symbol in the link attribute. So to fix that, we can simply prefix it with that. Now let's log this to see if it's working. Now if I click on the products, it will actually not work. And actually that's expected because we are trying to use the find method on the sections, but the sections is not an array, it's a node list. So to convert it to an array, we can say array.from, and that's it. Let's try this again. If I click here, now we are fetching the section, products, about, and contact, so it works. Now we have the section, now we need to scroll to that using scroll to with a smooth animation. So let's call window.scroll_to, and the top position should be the same as the top position of the section. And we can access that using section.offsetTop. And now for the behavior, it's gonna be smooth. Now let's try this. If I click to about, it scrolls with a smooth animation. Yeah, it works. But one thing we need to think about is that the URL is no longer updating when we click on one of these links. And the reason for that is because we are calling prevent default here. So the way to fix it, we need to implement that ourselves. And luckily we can do that using the history API. So let's say history.pushState. The first argument will be no, the second will be no, the third will be the section ID. Now let's save and try. If I click on products, it will update with products, home, it will update with home. Yeah, so that works. Now we get to the last section of this tutorial, which is how can we highlight these links based on the current scroll position. And this is a perfect fit for the intersection observer API. So if you are not familiar with that, don't worry, I'm going to explain how it works here. But first, let's create a new observer. So let's say const observer, new intersection observer, and it takes two arguments. The first one is a callback. So let's say on intersection, and the second one is some config object. And we're gonna for now just say threshold, and we're gonna pass an array with 0.5 and 1. Don't worry if this is confusing, I'm gonna explain everything here. So the idea of intersection observer is that we have a way where we can observe any element on the page. And once that element intersects with the viewport, meaning that once it enters the viewport or leaves the viewport, we can just fire an event and respond accordingly. So in this case, we are not observing anything. So we have an observer, but in our demo, we want to observe all the sections here. So let's do that below here. So we're gonna loop through all the sections by saying sections.forEach. For each section, we're gonna say observer.observe, and we're gonna observe that section. Now, remember, the callback is called on intersection, so let's define it here and see if we get any event fired here. So let's say function on intersection, and it's gonna accept an entries array. I'm gonna explain that in a little bit. Now let's just console log that. Entries. So you can see when I scroll, something is firing here, but we don't know what we are getting here. So let's see what that array contains. So let's say entries.forEach entry. Let's console log the element that is intersecting. So let's say console log entry, and we can access that from target. Now if I try to scroll, you can see we are logging these sections. Sometimes it's products, sometimes it's home. So what's happening here is that anytime a section enters or leaves that viewport, we're gonna log it here. But in our example, all we care about is whether the section is entering the viewport. So we can detect that using this. If entry is intersecting, then log it. So if I reload, you can see we are getting home here because that's the only one that is intersecting with the viewport. Now if I try to scroll, now it gets products. Now if I try to scroll, we can see about and then contact. And based on what section we are viewing, you can see how it fires here. But now we need to understand what this threshold is for. Now using this array, we can tell it how much of the section should be visible to fire an event. For example, when we say 0.5, then we are telling it whenever 50% of the section is visible or whenever 100% of the section is visible, then fire that event. So that means if I reload, you can see we are showing home because the whole home section is visible. Now, when I try to scroll, it's still saying home because we are only showing home like 50% of it or more, but the section below it is still less than 50%. Now, when I reach the half of that section, like this, it will fire for the products. And the same for the other sections. So it shows 50% and 100% based on experiment. So I tried a bunch of numbers and it seems that these numbers are the best ones working. Okay, now we get to the last section here. So we now access the section we are viewing on the page. What we need to do, we need to fetch the corresponding link so we can highlight it. So entry.target is the section. So let's store that in a variable. Let's say const section entry.target. Now again, we're gonna fetch the link based on the section ID. So to access the section ID, we can say section ID is section.dataset.section_ID. Now we have the section ID to fetch the link. We can say links.find link when the link.getAttribute tref is the same as the section ID. But remember, this should be prefixed with a hash symbol. So let's say hash symbol. And now let's store this in a variable. And all we have to do is just to say highlight link and pass it the link. Let's save and try. Now, you can see that we have some error here. But again, that's expected because we are using the find method on the links, but it's not an array. So let's convert it to an array by saying array.from. And now let's save. Okay, so now you can see we are highlighting the home because we are viewing the home. If I try to scroll, it will do that for the other sections. And when you click, it will work because it just depends on the intersection observer instead of on the click event. So it will work on any case you try. Okay, so we are done. The cool thing here is that we have wrapped everything in a single function called setup_scroll_spy. So regardless of whether you are using with a framework or in vanilla JavaScript, all you have to do is just to call this function, pass it the table of content element, and then it will just work. But of course, you have to make sure each section has data section ID so you can know which link corresponds to which section. And also you need to go to the CSS code and style the highlighted link. In this case, we are just setting the background color to something else. So I hope you learned something new here. Please let me know if you have any questions in the comment sections below. I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.